All right. Greetings, namaskara. My name is Dr. Karthik Agoram. I teach biology, specifically cell biology and biochemistry to undergraduate students. As a scientist and science communicator, it is my goal to cut through the internet rhetoric and go straight to the experts for scientific knowledge and information. Today, we are fortunate to have my dear friend and a brilliant scientist in our midst. To say the very least, Dr. Swab is an absolute inspiration. To prepare this introduction, I asked her to share a resume of her accomplishments, thinking I could pick a few things and use them as introductory material. But the accomplishments are so many, and the list is so long, that the entire episode will be taken up by this part. So let me just say this. She is a botanist and naturalist extraordinaire, a passionate teacher and communicator of science and scientific rigor, an unparalleled adventure and world traveler. When I think of the best ways to describe her, I think of two things. She's a walking encyclopedia, and she was green before green was cool. It is such an honor and delight to introduce to you all Dr. Janice Coffey Swab, Professor Emerita of Biological Sciences at Meredith College in Raleigh, North Carolina, USA. Dr. Swab, thank you so much, not only for agreeing to spend some time here with us and talk to us about your journey and for inspiring us, but also for allowing us to do this in your beautiful home amidst all the books and knowledge that surround us here. Thank you.
It's my great pleasure. I was surprised that you would ask such just a teacher to be a part of your casts, but it is my great pleasure.
Well, if we were to ask any of your students over the decades, they would not describe you as just a teacher, because we know enough about the impact that you've made on so many lives, not only to your students, but also to colleagues like me who have gained inspiration from everything that you do. So how about we get started with our questions here?
Okay.
So we just are curious to talk to us about your childhood growing up in North Carolina. So here you are working in a small college in North Carolina, but you started here in North Carolina. So tell us a little bit about how it was growing up and describe your childhood for us.
I lived in the country, and we lived largely on land with the gardens and canning for the winter. We butchered hogs for our meat. We had our calves killed for meat as well. My grandmother butchered, she didn't butcher, she killed chickens. So we had everything that we ate practically, and a huge garden. My mother, I remember her saying one week, this was a long time ago, of course, but I remember her saying that she spent $3 on groceries. And my father said, we'll have to cut back. This is in Western North Carolina, in Caldwell County in Lenore, North Carolina. And we just simply lived on, not a big ranch or anything, but we had land and used it and appreciated it.
So was growing up on the land sort of a starting point for you to become curious about nature, and that may have led to what you ended up studying, and that became a part of you?
I actually loved my high school physics teacher.
Oh,
he knew so much, and I thought, if I could know that much about something, I'd really be in a pretty good place. He was a wonderful teacher. He was our principal.
What was
his name? Dr. Laxton.
All right, shout out to Dr. Laxton.
Yes.
Yeah.
and I'll just point out parenthetically that in those days, having diabetes could be a death sentence. And he had type 1 diabetes.
Wow.
And handled it, but we all were just so amazed that he was able to live the life he lived, because diabetes was so scary.
Right.
And I just point that out parenthetically. I know you're interested in diabetes. But such a wonderful teacher. And then I went to Appalachian State Teachers College.
That's right.
The reason I went to Appalachian State Teachers College was because from the day I could talk, I wanted to teach somebody something. I wanted to read to them, which I couldn't read. I just made it up. But it was just such a pleasure to tell people something about the world. And so I majored in biology because I had wonderful science teachers at Appalachian, but my biology teachers were my favorite. And in my botany class, we got to go outside, and I felt so at home outside that I just decided I'd major in botany. And
But those were the beginnings of the botanist extraordinaire.
I just wanted to know everything I could about plants. And I was my professor's assistant. He chose me to be his assistant. And so I was always working with him. And Dr. I.W. Carpenter. He.
So this was as an undergraduate student,
As
you
an
had the
undergraduate.
opportunity to work with a
Yeah.
botanist.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And I just remember his statements about the plants and how important, and I knew nothing really, but I knew that I could learn from him.
Right.
And so then, when I was getting ready to graduate, he said, "Well, you'll need to go north to study biology." And my geology teacher said, "You have to go to South Carolina." So I just went. I can't say that I had this burning desire to go to a certain place and do a certain thing, except I just wanted to stay in biology. But when he said go to South Carolina, I went to the University of South Carolina and presented myself. And they accepted me. Those were different times. I have to.
So that's
point
when
out.
you probably used a typewriter to complete your application.
I
You
don't
put it in the
ever,
mail.
to tell you the truth, I don't ever remember completing an application.
Oh,
I
okay.
went down there in person and talked to people in the department.
Right.
I didn't know you couldn't, so it seemed like the thing to do.
Well, next thing you know, you're a doctoral student, right?
And the man that I met when I went to South Carolina to meet these people, that I was most impressed with, was a man who had just come back from India studying with Maheshwari, wonderfully known botanist. And I was green as grass. Now don't mistake me. I knew nothing about the world, nothing. And I looked up at him. He was really tall, and I said, "Dr. Herr," because I learned that he had been to India and had spent a postdoc and had spent a couple of years in India. And I said, "Dr. Herr, weren't you afraid you'd get lost? I mean, just so green." And he said, "Janice, it's hard to get lost in this world." And I have never forgotten that. I've been in the middle of, the middle of Siberia and in the forests of Borneo and all sorts of places. And I just remembered, it's hard to get lost in this world. You'll figure out where you are.
But like they say, all those who wander are not lost.
All those who wander are not lost. That's exactly. And I've done a lot of wandering in my day.
Right. So tell us a little bit about that. So I've always, asked you this question. How many countries have you visited, Dr. Swab? And I'm not sure I've gotten an answer, maybe because it keeps increasing, but tell me now, what's your count?
I have never counted.
You have never.
And I have never counted on purpose, because so many people, and I've been on lots of expedition voyages and things like that, and people are chopping up countries. Well, I've been so and so. Where have you been? So and so. Where have you been? And I just I think that matters less than what you've learned. Now, when somebody asks me, what have you learned from your travels? I love it. I can tell them lots of things. Why did I travel? Why do I travel? To learn. But simply counting countries, with some people counting airports that they have been in because they've been in that country, was just abhorrent to me. That's not the reason you travel, to say I've been somewhere. You travel to learn from that country. And there have been a lot of countries where I wasn't too sure whether I was going to really feel like I had spent my money wisely. And then it turns out to be wonderful. I'm going to give Japan as an example. I traveled with a group of botanists in Japan, and I wasn't that wild about going to Japan. It seemed so formal and everything had to be done just right. And I loved it. I loved it.
So what made you change your mind? What was it about Japan that made you change your mind and make you love it?
Well, for one thing, the botanists I was with, because they had so much to teach, and I learned some stuff. For example, I'll just give you one small example. In Japan, they were reforesting, and they were reforesting this huge area with 4 trees. And I thought, that's not the way you reforest. I knew nothing, but I thought that's not the way. But they showed us why they had chosen that and how in that particular area that was a better choice than just clearing the area and seeding and that kind of thing. So, but you have to ask a lot of questions if you are going to learn from your travel.
And not go assuming that.
That's right.
Just because this is the way you know how to do it, is the way that it has to be done everywhere.
And Americans are bad about that. I mean, you go and you're going to teach people how to do this, teach people how to do that. I prefer to learn why people are doing the things they're doing, because they have a reason. And most of these cultures are far older than ours, and they have survived because they knew how to do some things.
Right. So you mentioned earlier that your mentor at South Carolina had learned from Professor Maheshwari in India.
Yes.
So it may not be very obvious, but I have a master's degree in botany also, right? And it's not obvious because I don't know much in botany, but Professor Maheshwari's textbooks were sort of a gold mine of information for us. So there were I think there were multiple Maheshwaris, a father and a son, but it was the palynologist, the pollen biologist, Maheshwari, that we are all, whose textbooks we read. So that brings me to your exploits in India. So tell us a little bit about when you went to India, and maybe a couple of things about what you learned there that still have an impact on you.
One thing is, by the professor I was talking about, who had studied in India, he had studied embryology,
Right.
because this Maheshwari, whichever one it was, the textbook, was evidently the world's best plant embryologist.
Yeah.
And plant embryology is not easy, and once you learn it, it really drives you nuts when people compare plants to animals and that kind of thing. I just want to point that out.
That's right.
Parenthetically. But actually, I didn't go to India until I got my degree. I'll be aging myself, which is fine. I'm grateful to have lived. I got my PhD in 1966 and went to and taught 1 year in Clemson, and then went to Queens College in Charlotte, North Carolina. In fact, I have mostly taught in North Carolina since I got my PhD when I'm in the country.
Right.
I try to teach out of the country as much as I can. But it was 1984 when I went to, it was 83 when I went to India. And I went with a Fulbright group who were studying science and technology. We were going to learn how Indians did this, that, and the other. It was not science, it was just a group of professors learning as much as we could about science and technology. And I want you to know, I met and had a group conversation with Indira Gandhi.
Oh, you did?
It was one
That's
of the
right.
highlights of my life.
Right, of course, for those who are watching who are not familiar with Indira Gandhi, she was one of the most powerful prime ministers in the history of Indian independence or post-independence India.
And she was so gracious and just to be where she was and who she was, I was impressed. And it's, like I say, it's one of the best experiences I've ever had. The only other person that I would love to have met was South African, dear, right now his name, the first,
Nelson Mandela.
Nelson Mandela, the first prime minister after apartheid.
Yeah.
What a wonderful experience it would have been to have met him. But speaking of India, what I learned in India, if you wanted to just sum it up, is they have so many different ways of doing things than we do, but it works.
Yeah.
And how ingenious they are in putting, you see this kind of rolling 3-wheel things with an engine on it that they've rigged up and they do what they need to do with it. That's just one example.
Yeah.
But such ingenuity, and the Fulbright Commission chose professors to go on the basis of their application, and I did everything I could to impress them because I wanted to visit this huge country. And of course, now the most populous country in the world.
That's right, and also far removed from the early 80s in terms of economic growth and development and what people are able to do with science and technology.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And who is it that we choose to try to get them to come to the US and bring us their tech expertise? It's Indians. I mean, you look at the triangle and see the number of Indians here in the tech field. It's amazing. And I've just never forgotten that trip. I've never been back because I spent a summer. So I was there for 10 weeks. And it was just so intense and full of learning that I still refer to that trip when I'm trying to make a point or trying to tell people about something about the world.
Right.
India comes up.
So tell me, during our conversations over the years, you've told me about your trip to Banaras.
Mm-hmm.
When other people in your group were a little apprehensive, let's just say, of traveling to Banaras, you just broke off and went there on your own.
I didn't see any reason why I couldn't.
Yeah.
Remember, it's hard to get lost in this world, so I knew I wasn't going to get lost, but it was the place to go because you could see a way of death. You know, we talk about what's the way of life. Well, I think we should ask, what's the way of death? And that's where you see the way of death in India. And it seemed to make so much sense with such a huge population that you didn't take acres and acres and acres of land to bury bodies in material that wouldn't decay. It just didn't make any sense.
Yeah. So, of course, the trip to India was extremely impactful. But one of the things that I've known you for is your connection to Darwin.
Oh.
So, and I know you sort of traced the Darwinian path, maybe multiple times, but if you can tell us a little bit about what got you on these journeys to begin with, and just let us learn something about what Darwin means to you, and maybe a little bit about the explorations that you've taken and how they impacted you and your career, your teaching.
We ignored Darwin to our perils. Not that he had all the answers, that's not the point, but he is the beginning of the acceptance of evolution in the sense of organisms changing through time. And I had been teaching decades before. My husband and I had a sabbatical, and my husband and I were traveling in South America. We first went to teach in Bolivia, and then we were traveling. So one of the things that we were doing was going to Antarctica, and we started south from Bolivia, and we went to Antarctica, and then we came up the west coast and visited almost every country in South America. But everywhere we went, there seemed to be some kind of Darwin connection. I hadn't really thought that much about following Darwin, as I later said. But I got the Voyage of the Beagle, and I said, we've got a great opportunity here to see places as they are today, as they were at the turn of the century. This was 2001. I had already been to places that Darwin had been, but not as a Darwin aficionado. And so we started making our way around South America.
So you essentially traced the path of the beagle.
Yes.
Which was
5 years.
Right.
From England to England.
Right.
It was an around the world voyage. He left because he was asked to go as a gentleman to be with the captain, because the captain was a gentleman and he couldn't eat with these people that he picked up off the street to run the ship. He had to have a dining companion. And so Darwin filled that. And it's just such a wonderful story, and I'm not going to tell it because you don't have time. But they spent 3 of the 5 years. It was a surveying ship. The Beagle was a surveying ship. And incidentally, it was not unusual for English to name their ships after dogs. So that was not special. Lots of ships were named after dogs. This just happened to be Beagle. And so they spent 3 of the 5 years surveying South America. And the amount of time and the places they went, it hardly mattered where we went, we would have some Darwin connection.
Yeah.
And we went to the Falklands. That's also where the Beagle went. And I could, we could spend the rest of the time talking about one individual place. But the interesting thing was, because you begin to think 1831 to 1835 was the voyage. And here you are in the year 2001. Much of this was done in 2001. How has the world changed? It occurred to me that that was what I was going to focus on.
Right.
When I was in Peru, where had Darwin been and how had it changed? When I was in Chile, how had it been in Darwin's day? Because it's all there. It's all been described. But then how much could we find? And some of the same vistas that we could see in South America, looking from this high peak or this mountain or this whatever, was the same vista that Darwin saw. How had it changed?
So you're trying to see if what you were looking at was what he looked at, trying to look through his eyes and
see, yeah.
that.
And now and then, it clicked. You saw exactly what he described.
Yeah.
And then again, it was so completely changed.
Yeah.
For example, let's just use the big cities, like Argentina, like Buenos Aires in Argentina. There was nothing left that you could possibly think that Darwin would have even, it would have been possible for him to recognize. That's just one example. There are lots of others. And of course, the less that things had changed, the more like they were, the more you could see
Right.
that of what Darwin was describing. And so I will tell you that the first place that I ever went that Darwin is so known for was the Galapagos Islands,
Yeah.
which is a totally, well, I won't say totally, but largely mythological telling of Darwin, of his ideas, of why he was at a place and all of that.
I was going to ask you about, tell us about some misconceptions people have about Darwin, but here we are. So keep going.
The biggest
Yeah.
The biggest one, and I have students who will write on some occasion, Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands so he could discover evolution. I mean, that is so long on so many levels that mostly I just want to cry, but it is just so interesting. And why do people have these ideas? Because other people have written that such and such and such and such and such and such, mostly misconceptions. Of course, that's the reason people go to the Galapagos today. And my message is, don't go. Send your money to the Darwin Foundation that is planting trees. The trees in the Galapagos are highly endangered. And if we're going to have trees, native trees in the Galapagos, people are going to have to plant them. And that's what the Darwin Foundation does. And and I just have to mention them.
Of course you do.
And
Yeah,
for people
we
with
all-
money,
Yeah.
that's the place to send it.
I'm not sure how many people who have a lot of money are going to watch this, but we make sure it gets across to some. So
They'll read
that's right,
something
yeah.
that they wouldn't
That's
have
right.
read otherwise.
yeah, or people who watch it today may come into money later.
That's true.
That's right. Can never
And remember
discount that,
that's
so.
what I should do.
That's right. Yeah.
Because as goes, I don't have time to expound on this. As goes the Galapagos, goes the rest of the world. Because the destruction of such a magnificent place when it was first, quote, discovered, because in fact it was, there was no indigenous population. Because, we say we discovered this and discovered that. Well, people have been living there 10,000 years. But in the case of the Galapagos Islands, when it was discovered, that was a true discovery. And humans had not been involved in the evolution of those islands, and would that we could at least keep as much, and of course I'm talking about the flora. Everybody goes to see the tortoises. I'm not saying that they don't. They do.
We like animals, but plants are special.
That's right.
Yeah.
People don't appreciate plants simply because they haven't been led to appreciate plants. But in fact, if we destroyed all the plants tomorrow, we'd go day after tomorrow.
That's right.
So I mean, that is the take home message.
So speaking of plants and your passion for plants over the decades, right? Not everybody has an opportunity or has done enough or has achieved enough to have things named after them. Now, there are a couple of things that, that I already knew that were named after you. For example, the Sustainability Award at Meredith.
Okay.
The Dr. Janice Coffey Swab Sustainability Award. There's a native plant garden at Meredith College that is named after. But as you know, somewhat of a botanist for me, I'm very fascinated by the plant that was named after you. So tell us about how that came about. Who discovered this plant? What kind of plant is it? And why is it named after you?
You might ask that question, just why? I met an orchidologist, one of the finest orchidologists in the world.
So orchidologist is a thing. It's a
Orchidologist
profession.
is a profession that he studies orchids. Because the orchid family is the largest plant family. There are more orchids, more species of orchids than any other family. So people who study orchids take on a lot. Well, I met this guy on Borneo. He was visiting a professor, I was visiting a professor, and he was much, much younger than I.
So
And-
Borneo is a small island
Yes.
off of Indonesia? Or
Yes,
it's part of Indonesia?
no,
No.
it's its own.
It's-
There are
yeah,
three,
okay.
there are three countries actually that make up. And he and I were visiting a man who actually from the University of Michigan, who was spending his sabbatical in Sabah, where Mount well, just a second, I'll tell you what mountain we climbed. Was living there and studying the vegetation. And this man's name was Eric Christensen. And we were climbing Kinabalu. And the reason he was climbing Kinabalu is because there are 1,500 species of white or whitish orchids growing on that mountain,
All native to that mountain.
native to that mountain.
That is
Which
incredible.
is totally incredible.
Yeah.
And so we were gonna climb, and I was climbing because I'm interested to see. And so many other interesting plants, oh my gosh. And so we started our climb, and it's a hard climb. I was much younger then.
Yeah.
And so we started our climb, and about, 2/3 of the way through the first day, he said, Janice, he was not in very good shape. He should have been in better shape for a botanist, but no. And he said, Janice, I'm going to give you my food and I'm going back.
Oh,
He just couldn't make it. He was very, very, well, he just couldn't make it. Let's put it that way. But he gave me his food. That was the important part, because he knew I was going to still climb.
nothing was gonna stop you. Right.
In fact, I have a basket that the climbers who helped people climb hanging on my wall, and so that is the way that I met Eric, and we became friends, and were friends for years. He's no longer living, I'm sorry to say, but he was not in good health, and that is the reason. But one day I got an envelope in the mail, and it was from Eric, which was not unusual. And he said, I want you to read this paper. And it was a paper that he had published with a new orchid species. And the genus is Maxillaria. There are only about 600 and something species of Maxillaria.
Only 600, right?
And he had named, and it said a new species of Maxillaria. And it was Maxillaria janicea, my name, Janiceae. You know, botanists have to try to Latinize
So this
everything.
came as a total surprise for you.
Total, complete,
Wow.
complete surprise. And so I read the description, and I read where it was found. He identified it from a herbarium specimen in Colombia, because no one had ever identified that plant. And he never saw it before and he never saw it again. He only saw it on that one sheet. And but he knew it was a new species, described it just as he should. And he said the species is named for my friend and colleague, Dr. Janice Coffey Swab. And I'm naming it because of her love for plants and education.
All
Wasn't that sweet?
And also because it's one of a kind.
And he said it is the only one I ever saw. And but it was and why would he give it my first name? Because when you name things, you usually use the last name.
Right.
And he said, you can change your last name, but nobody changes their first name.
Those are words of wisdom.
And those are words of wisdom. And but that's the reason he did it.
Right,
I mean, he
yeah.
explained it right there.
How thoughtful.
And
Yeah.
but that was the story. And it's especially meaningful because he was my friend and because it was one of a kind, at least at that point. I don't even know now.
Right.
I don't know whether it's been found again. But he had named lots of species, so it was not, in that sense, not special. And it wasn't one, the only species in the genus. There were hundreds, and that makes me feel better because
that's such an honor. That is, I mean, to spend your whole life not only studying plants, but also having a passion for them and sharing that with everybody, and then having a plant named after you.
It really was an honor. And someone pointed this out to me. I didn't even think about it, but they said, it's rare that a native wild species is named after a person. People name their cultivars because there are thousands and thousands of cultivars, new varieties, new species named for people because so and so did it. So, but they said it's most unusual to have a native wild plant named, and I just thought that's wonderful. Maybe Aaron.
So a cultivar is a cultivated variety.
A cultivated variety.
Okay, whereas a native wild is just what has.
It's what's out there.
What nature has selected.
Yes.
To be there.
Yes. And I'd never thought about that.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether I don't know whether he did or not, but I bet he did because he lived orchids. He was just a wonderful botanist and spent his life. Yeah. In fact, he was found dead at his desk studying orchids. So he studied them. And when he was in college, everybody loves to talk about the fact that he had so many orchids in his room that nobody could make their way in or out. He was the only one who could get in or out.
And I'm sure he knew exactly which species everyone
of them.
Right.
And that's as a student.
Yeah.
That is as a student. But a lesson to us all. And I want to just parenthetically say this. If you love, I've heard this said, I didn't make this up, but I wish I had. If you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. He never worked a day in his life. And I think about that.
So this is a great way to sort of change direction here from plants, but move into things that as a science educator, and also as someone who educates others to then carry the message of science and scientific rigor. Any pieces of advice for future teachers of science that you can encapsulate in a couple of sentences?
I have been teaching forever science methodology, the methods of teaching science in the middle and secondary schools. And the most important thing for a teacher is to love learning. If you approach teaching as a job, and you do not love learning, you will have missed a wonderful opportunity. Better that you go work in a lab, or better that you go work in the field. But if you are going to work with students, love what you do. They will know and they will learn.
Yeah.
They might not like the field, but they will see why it's possible and how it's possible to like it.
Or they may not know that they are going to like the
Okay.
field. And having the passion to then maybe get them to do so, I think
Yes.
is one of the most impactful things.
I think so. And I'm so distressed because the state of North Carolina in the biology curriculum essentially ignores plants. And we do that to our peril.
Yeah.
I'll not go further with that, except to say that we're missing a wonderful opportunity.
So Dr. Swab, you have seen the world. I mean, literally seen the world. You've seen it change over time. So I have two last questions for you as we wrap this up. Give me three things that make you feel pessimistic about the world.
I am not pessimistic about the world. The world is fine. We talk about saving the earth. That is just beyond silly. We are not going to save or not save the earth. The earth has been here for billions of years before we got here, and it has about, what, 7 or so billion years left. It will keep circling the sun as long as there is a sun. And what dies will die. What regenerates will regenerate. The earth, the surface of this earth was nothing like it is today. Even 3 billion years ago, it was not even identifiable as a surface. The organisms we know, everybody loves dinosaurs. The life, animal, plant, fungal, I don't care what, life has not been anything like the same year after year, decade after decade, et cetera, millennium after millennium. I am not worried about the earth. What people mean when they talk about saving the earth, they are talking about saving this species because we are doing a great job of making the earth incompatible with what we need as a species. And I can't say that too strongly.
Yeah.
But when you say about the earth and am I pessimistic? No. About this species, yes.
So then tell me one or two things that make you optimistic about the species.
Is that we can learn.
Yeah.
It has been, if I didn't think we could learn, I would not be teaching. So I think that we can. And in fact, we have learned a little bit from the global warming realization. Sure, not everybody accepts it, but everybody's got the right to be as ridiculous as they want to be. But we have the capacity to learn. And number two is that we love our children and grandchildren. And if we can get people to think about the world as it goes on and on, do we not want a world where our children and grandchildren can live, our great-grandchildren, and on and on and on? If we really get that concept, we can change things. I think the third is, if I have to give a third, is that we will make the most of the lives that we live. As you know, we don't live right now this current generation is not living as long as the generation just before and the generation before that. Why? Poisons and all of the things that we think we need that we don't need, the ways we grow and the kind of food that we eat. That we can change all that. And it means a lot, it means a lot of change.
Well, Dr. Schwab, you are one of the reasons that we have a better world than there was decades ago, before you came in and you put in your passion to teach not only about plants, but also about teaching to so many students over the decades. So, and as one of your colleagues for the last 2 decades, it's been such an honor to know you, to learn from you, and to have these conversations. So thank you so much for spending this time with us. And I hope you inspire whoever watches this as much as you've inspired me over the decades. So
Go
thank
out
you.
and teach.